Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about a few different topics. We're going to start off today talking about Nat Turner a little bit. Nat Turner was a slave on a plantation who had been kind of given this appointed role as being like the preacher. This was before slaves, like it was illegal for slaves to know how to read or write. It's going to actually be his revolt that's going to kind of help lead to that becoming a law. He was self-educated for the most part. He would lead the church service for the slaves on the plantation. And he started having what he called visions, that God was going to give him some kind of a sign, to lead a slave revolt which means a sudden uprising, and free all the slaves in the South using this revolt. And then one day he saw a solar eclipse and he believed like that was the signal from God to start this uprising. And there had been many uprisings and slave revolts in the United States. If we look at this map, between 1526 and 1864, there were a total of about 313 different, at least documented, insurrections. There probably were many, many more smaller ones that just hadn't been written down. The four states that had the highest number of insurrections in this time period were definitely in Virginia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi. This map shows us the size of some of these revolts. Each of those different black dots, the larger the black circle is, the bigger the revolt was. And as you can see, the one that happened in Florida is considered to be like the most people. Like it's based on how many participants were involved. So with the Seminole, a lot of runaway slaves had escaped into the swamps in Florida, even after Florida became a state, and it was just very difficult to try to track them down in there because the Seminole have been there for so long that they just know the territory very well and can just avoid capture for the most part. And so, like, that one was definitely, like, one of the bigger ones, but this is definitely the most famous one. The revolt started with just one plantation and about 6 slaves, including Nat Turner. And over the course of this revolt's runtime, it spread to 10 different plantations and over 70 slaves before the slaveholders all just kind of joined together and put a stop to the revolt. Nat Turner was hunted down, and he and his followers were tortured and then hung in the trees. We don't know where his body is buried still to this day. But this is going to be what kind of like spooked a lot of slave owners, like, oh, like that's a huge possibility that a bunch of slaves could rise up together and fight back. And this could have spread a lot more. And it was an extremely violent attack as well. Nat Turner killed the family inside of the big house before he was killed. But another thing that's going to kind of change the idea of slavery and what slavery is and what it should be and how, or even if the United States could put a stop to it peacefully, is this man right here. His name is Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. His owner was a businessman and would often travel to other states, bringing Dred Scott with him, to kind of like run errands for him and just do things for him and wait on him and like basically be a butler while they were traveling around. And there was one business trip that they went on where Dred Scott was taken by his master to Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which were free states. And we've talked about the Missouri Compromise before. Which was when the United States, in order to kind of like keep the balance between the slave and free states, drew that line across the map saying everything above the line is going to be a free state, everything below that line is going to be a slave state. And both Illinois and Wisconsin are above the Missouri Compromise line. And so what ended up happening is that while they were staying in these free states, there was one morning Dred Scott got up and got ready and then went to go wake up his master because that's one of his jobs in the morning. And he knocked on the door and there was no answer. And so he knocked again and there was still no answer. And so he just kind of quietly like pushed open the door and looked in, and his master had died sometime during the night. And so because they were in a free state, Dred Scott figured, well, my master's dead. I'm in a free state by myself. I'm free, right? Like I have my freedom. And he wrote a letter to his mistress, like back home, his dead master's wife, and was like, hey, I'm free, right? Like I'm good. And he like tried to be like, I can like send you some money after I stay here for a little bit. And she said, absolutely not. Like you belong to me now. You have to come back. And he was like, absolutely not. I'm not going anywhere. And so he decided to do what he thought was like the right thing and sued for his freedom. So he actually took his slave owners to court to argue that he should be free now. And he argued that since his slave owner had died, he has no owner now. And this became a huge national issue. This really blew up because it brought up a lot of questions about slavery that people hadn't really wanted to think about or just hadn't thought to think about before now. Questions like, can a slave like even do this? Is this a possibility for a slave to sue their white slave owners for their freedom? And if a slave is able to do that, then does that make them a person, or does that make them, are they still property? Like legally, are they property now? And if a slave is able to do this, that means they're a person. And that means slavery like can't happen in the United States because all men are created equal. So is slavery itself even legal in the United States because of this now? Scott's argument was that since he had lived for such a long time in a free state, he should now legally be free. And he won his court case. He was granted his freedom, which was immediately reversed by the Missouri Supreme Court. So even after getting his freedom the first time and having it taken away again, he decided, well, if the Missouri State Supreme Court says that I can't do this, I'm going to now take it to the highest court, the one that like makes all the decisions, and I'm going to take this to the U.S. Supreme Court. This court case is known as Scott versus Sanford. There were a lot of different Supreme Court justices who were there. Some of them were against slavery, some of them were in favor of it. A couple of them called it a humiliating spectacle. They said that it was unreasonable for a slave to be freed based on the argument that like they touched a free state and now they're entitled to their freedom. It was almost like they were arguing like just because you like touch home base does not mean you're automatically free. And so they argued that like, this is a quote from them, that if you compare slavery with the state that they were in Africa, like it's way better here in the United States. They should be grateful to be slaves over here compared to that of their condition over in Africa, trying to argue that it was better in slavery than living in Africa. The Supreme Court's decision was read out by the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time, who was named Roger B. Taney. He ruled, he made two different decisions in the Supreme Court case. The first one said that everybody of African ancestry, slaves as well as those who were free, could never become citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. Saying that nobody who was African American, whether you were a slave or not, had any kind of legal rights under the Constitution. They were not citizens and they never could be citizens. He also ruled that like, hey, it's kind of not fair that the Missouri Compromise is stopping all these other states from having slavery if they want it. And so the federal government no longer has the power to prohibit slavery in any of its territories because it's stopping its citizens from having their constitutional protection of their property, is what he said. So he not only does away with any hope that African Americans had while he was still alive to become citizens and for slavery to end, but he also got rid of like the one compromise right now that's kind of holding everything together. And this is a quote by him to kind of like explain why he said what he said, saying, "They had slaves for more than a century before being regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race," talking about the South from his point of view. And I mean, you can't really expect much better from a guy who looks like Senator Palpatine from the Star Wars movies. So I want to ask you guys, like, because the Supreme Court has to be able to, like, look at the Constitution and look at the amendments and be able to point out, like, which parts of the Constitution or the amendments that a certain law or a certain act, like, violates. And the amendment that he said that the Missouri Compromise violated was the Fifth Amendment, which has a lot of stuff in it. We've talked about this like way, way, way back when we talked about the Bill of Rights. It talks about like having a speedy trial, and you don't have to like speak against yourself if you don't want to. Have to have a grand jury. But the part specifically, the like one sentence that he's referring to is that people cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, meaning that he has now legally made slaves people and not property, which made slavery legal, because the government had never come in and like given an official stance on slavery. It was just like, oh, like the states can do whatever they want, but the federal government had never actually come in and said one way or the other whether or not slavery was okay in the United States. They were just kind of pretending like it didn't really matter. But now, because of this Supreme Court Chief Justice, it's now legal, and it's going to be staying around in the United States for a very long time. To the point where, like, this is probably the best example I can give of why it's so important, or rather, when a new Supreme Court justice has to be chosen by whoever's president at the time. This is part of the reason why people get so, like, kind of hot and bothered about it, because once those people are chosen, they are in the Supreme Court until they either retire or die. They can't really be not gotten rid of, but they won't really leave otherwise. And they'll make a lot of decisions that affect a lot of people. The impact of this court case was that the Supreme Court just legalized slavery. Congress can no longer stop any slave owner from moving his slaves to a new territory. So now that line that the Missouri Compromise drew is gone. They can just go wherever they want to now. And the Missouri Compromise and any other similar compromise that tried to limit the spread of slavery is declared unconstitutional. So like I said before, I showed you this map before, that Missouri Compromise line does not exist. And so this is kind of what the United States looked like before the court case in 1850, where the green states are free, the yellow states are slave states, and the purple states were the ones that were going to be able to vote on whether or not to be a free or slave state after the Compromise of 1850. But now, because of the Dred Scott case, everything that's shaded yellow on this map is now territory that's been opened up to become a slave state, possibly. And so you can see by looking at how much territory the yellow and orange covers here, just why the free states are so upset about this. This decision was well received by slaveholders in the South. The North was outraged by this. They refused to pass the Fugitive Slave Act in the Compromise of 1850. The free states passed all kinds of personal liberty laws, which were these laws that gave runaway slaves the right to a trial by jury and habeas corpus and all these other rights that just because the Supreme Court says you don't have these rights, the states are going to give you these rights inside of our borders. The Republican Party, which is a brand new party that's going to have Abraham Lincoln run as its first presidential candidate, claimed that the decision's not binding, this doesn't count, we don't accept this. Southerners called on the North and said, hey, if you don't accept the Supreme Court decision, we're not so sure we want to stay in the United States. Like, we'll pack up and leave unless you accept this. This Supreme Court decision greatly influenced whether or not Abraham Lincoln became nominated as the Republican Party candidate in the next election. They were pretty sure that, like, based on the things that he had said, that he would be able to fix all these problems that slavery had attached to it. And that's going to directly cause the South to secede from the Union. Dred Scott's defense lawyers were devastated that he couldn't help Dred Scott get his freedom. Like, he had tried super hard, and when they, like, had actually, like, they never even really had stood a chance, because as soon as they walked into that courtroom, Roger B. Taney saw Dred Scott standing there, looked at what the case was about, and he's like, this is an outrage, this is ridiculous. You have as much right to sue for your freedom as my briefcase does to sue me for its freedom. Comparing him to a piece of luggage, just a thing, a piece of property. And so Dred Scott was taken back to his original plantation, and his defense lawyer just kind of lost track of him after that. Years and years and years later, the defense lawyer's wife got a letter saying that, like, one of her relatives had passed away and they'd left some stuff to her in their will. And they're looking through and they're like, oh, there's like a list of slaves on here, because she had family in the South. And they're like, oh boy. And it listed out the names of the slaves that were being left to her. And there were 2 names on there that were very familiar. And those names were Dred Scott and his wife Harriet. And so the defense lawyer started freaking out. It's like, I can finally give Dred Scott his freedom that I tried to do like all those years ago. I can finally do this. And he gave both of them their freedom. And Dred Scott is 58 years old and finally has that freedom that he worked so long for. And then he died 9 months later. This is Dred Scott's grave, and this is his wife Harriet's. They've been updated over time just because they were very, very old. And there's this cool thing that people started doing to Dred Scott's grave after a little bit, where instead of leaving things like flowers and other things on his grave, they would leave pennies on there, because it has Abraham Lincoln's face on there, who wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and gave the slaves their freedom. And people leave it there so that, just as a way of being like, you weren't able to enjoy your freedom for very long, but because of what you did, hundreds and millions of people are going to be able to enjoy it because of you. And there was this thing, I don't know, I haven't looked into it in a while, but I know there was a fund where people were collecting the pennies from Dred Scott's grave, and you could donate just like money to it anyway. And they were going to use that money to build a statue of Dred Scott outside of the original courthouse where he first sued for his freedom as a monument to him. And I don't know if they ever reached their goal or not. I haven't looked into it in a while, but it's a pretty cool thing to look into if you're interested. But we talked about Abraham Lincoln here, and so I think it's very important to talk about him and how he just kind of comes onto the scene here in politics. So we're going to talk about him next, because Abraham Lincoln is going to get involved in what are known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. These debates were not presidential debates. These 2 different candidates, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, were both running for senator of Illinois. And the reason why, even though it's not a presidential debate, it's just like, you know, for senator, but it's still a very important series of debates because they're going to make Lincoln a much stronger candidate for the Republican Party nominee for president. Like before this, people hadn't really heard of him. And then after these debates happened and after the Dred Scott trial, people were like, yeah, that Abraham Lincoln guy like says a lot of things that we like kind of agree with. He'd probably make a good candidate for president. They were both running for Senate in Illinois, and Illinois was kind of a weird state where it was almost like a mini version of what was happening in the United States, where the northern part of Illinois was very abolitionist and anti-slavery, but the southern half of Illinois was pro-slavery. And then the middle section was just kind of like in between and could go either way. Lincoln really wanted to focus. He knew he was going to have the northern part of Illinois. And he knew, like, no matter what he did, Douglas was probably going to get the southern part of Illinois to vote for him. And so it's these middle areas that he really wanted to pull over and win to his side. And so he figured the best way for him to be able to do that was to get Douglas in a situation where very publicly they could argue about these issues. And so it was beneficial for both of them to get involved because Douglas would also want to try to pull those middle areas and middle counties of Illinois over to his side. So he invited Douglas to these joint debates, and politicians have never done this before. Now it's very common in different elections, especially presidential elections, that they get together and have debates and take turns stating their arguments and their opinions on the different issues. and answering different people's questions. And so the way these debates would go is that there would be 1 hour for the first speaker, and then 1.5 hours for the second speaker. And then the first speaker could come in and spend 30 minutes rebutting their last argument. And then they'd go on to the next city and do the same thing. And they did this in, if I go back and look at this map, they did it in 7 different cities scattered all over Illinois. There were a ton of different issues that they debated over in here, such as, are the Western territories going to be open to slavery, and should they be opened up to slavery? Would slavery be allowed in the states where it's currently illegal? Like, do the states that have stated that they're against slavery and they don't allow it, would it be a possibility for those states to be opened up to slavery, and should they be? And did the Founding Fathers intend, when they built the country, for half of the country to be free and half of it to be slave? And did one group of states have the right to tell another group of states what was right and what was wrong? And those are like the main issues that they are going to spend this debate debating over. And while it's like, there wasn't really like a thing where like you picked a winner, but Abraham Lincoln was such a good speaker that it was very difficult to walk away from it. And like these like debates were like long, and it was just a thing where people would like dress up in their Sunday clothes and they'd go and have a picnic and listen to these guys argue with each other for like 3 hours at a time. And they traveled. Some people like traveled to every city that they went to just because they wanted to hear the debate continue at the next city. And it was just a way for them to like, it just kind of brought a lot more awareness to these issues, and it got people to actually think about more like, yeah, like we need to actually, instead of being wishy-washy and just kind of putting this off and putting this off, we need to have an actual answer to this issue. Are we going to keep slavery around forever? Are we going to limit it where it is? And in these debates, a lot of people believe that Abraham Lincoln like started off just being like, no, we're going to get rid of slavery everywhere. And that's what a lot of people in the South at the time thought Abraham Lincoln wanted to do. And that's something that Stephen Douglas kept like implying, that no, Abraham Lincoln, he wants to get rid of all slavery. Me, you can do whatever you want. Like, I'm all for it. But that's not true. Abraham Lincoln actually didn't believe that you could just get rid of slavery all at once. He wanted to, but he didn't think it could be done without like a huge blowout. And so what he actually wanted to do was to just limit it to where it already is. The states that currently are slave states, that's going to be it. And we're not going to allow it into any more territories. He had a lot of good quotes, and these are just some different sections from his debates, talking about that when Douglas says that if people want slavery, then they have the right to have it, then he's blowing out, like, he's ignoring all the moral issues that go along with it. And when he says that, like, he doesn't care if slavery is voted up or down, just let the people do what they want, then he's like eradicating, as he says here, the light of reason and the love of liberty on the American continent. He also said that, can the people of the United States territory in any lawful way against the wishes of any citizen in the United States exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Meaning that like the state governments will get to choose, but it should still be like limited. And can the government be able to feasibly tell these states what to do? And meanwhile, Douglas believed that the North and South are just so different. And the Founding Fathers knew that the North and South were just very different. And so, yeah, they totally meant for the country to be split down the middle, half of it being free states and half of it being slave state. This was intentional. In that we've been a country for 70 years that has thrived on this concept of popular sovereignty, meaning that Douglas believed that the states should be able to vote on whether to be free states or slave states, and they just kind of went back and forth like this in this series of 7 different debates all across the state of Illinois. And it just brought a lot of attention to Abraham Lincoln, like, yeah, he's saying a lot of stuff that we kind of agree with, especially on the anti-slavery side. He also got attention from the pro-slavery side here, though, too, where they started paying attention more but it was more like, oh, we got to make sure this guy doesn't become president, because if he becomes president, he's going to try to get rid of slavery everywhere, and we don't want that. Even though Abraham Lincoln never once said that that's what he wanted to do. He just wanted to limit it to where it already was. We are ramping up very quickly to the Civil War. So if you have any questions, please make sure you ask me. And then you have 2 box reviews on Google Classroom, so make sure you do those as well.